walking along a path at the foot of Pikes Peak, you get the feeling that you've been here before. You read somewhere at some time that you weren't supposed to be here and you're not supposed to be doing the thing that you're doing. There's a lesson here somewhere and you've missed it. Regardless, taking a fork in the road, you enter the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside, you find a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and how the poem The Jabberwocky is possibly the greatest work in the history of the English language. Over in the corner, by the fire, are three people. One of them just won't shut up with questions about how the world of the wind in the willows works. Are the frogs and mice the size of people, or are they the size of regular frogs and mice? And if they're the size of regular frogs and mice, how can they drive cars? But they have horses. Wait. Anyway, that person's me, Matthew Mellema, and I'm your co-host of Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. The Anselm Society is a coalition of churches across the Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one very simple goal, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. To further this goal, we do all sorts of things. COVID permitting, you know the drill by now. Each spring, we have our big Imagination Redeemed conference, which attracts folks from all across the country. We also have a regular slate of concerts, lectures, and other events designed to foster love and understanding of arts and faith. And we have our own Guild of Artists right here in Colorado Springs. And when we as a guild aren't creating art, some of us like to podcast, so Believe to See. To find out more about the Anselm Society, please visit us over at anselmsociety.org. And while you're there, or while you're on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, why don't you leave us a 5-star review? We would super appreciate it. I love it when we get a new review. I think I've been telling you all I enjoy writing reviews now. It's really simple, and it's a really simple way to show other podcasts that I appreciate them and to raise their visibility, but you know that by now. But maybe something you don't know by now is, well, Evangeline, I'm not going to lie. I thought I'd have a really great segue to bring you onto the show and with something that was arts related, but it all just sort of evaporated. But how are you, Evangeline?
I'm hanging in there. I am ready to spend some time in like a faraway land or in like the idyllic countryside or anything that is an escape from COVID and such topics. So I'm looking forward to talking about our topic tonight.
Oh, good. Me too. And yeah, I think this show will post probably a few weeks after we record it. It's middle of November right now. COVID's on the increase. Lockdowns are coming. So who knows what world this will be transported out into. I don't know. Maybe the aliens will finally come, or the sweet meteor of death will just come. I don't know. But at any rate, I am very much looking forward to this topic. And let me set the scene for you guys about the genesis of this topic. So several months ago, me and Danielle were chatting with one of the relatively newer people at our church, International Anglican Church. And, you know, we have a lot in common. We both like books. We start chatting. And I find out that this guy not only likes books, but he's done sort of a deep dive and an area of intense study on children's books from around 1900. This is obviously right up my lane, and we started talking for a long time, and I probably kept him from getting a lot of other work done after church, but it also made me confirm, okay, we need to have this guy on the podcast. He's been to different Anselm events in the past. I think you were at the Imagination Redeemed conference back when we could meet people in person. But anyway, Ben Keiser, welcome to the show.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Matt. It's great to be on. I'm really excited to just have some more conversation about books. All of our conversations in the past have been great, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do still go to church together, even though going to a church together is sort of a weird topic right now. We wave at each other from socially distanced while
That's
wearing
right.
masks. But now even that may not be allowed with the new restrictions, so who the heck knows? But anyway, Ben, why don't you explain to the listeners at home just a little bit about you and the things that you do?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I've been a writer here. I've been working for Summit Ministries, which is a local ministry here in Manitou Springs. And I have been writing on pop culture, worldview, Christian thought for about 2.5 years with them. Just a really unique opportunity that they gave me a little while ago. And yeah, just have a blast doing it, talking about what the latest ideas are in culture and, you know, what we can learn from them, trying to evaluate them. So that's what I do with Summit. I'm also at the moment working on a master's degree in spiritual theology from Regent College. So that's kind of what's taken up a lot of my time at the moment. Of course, I'm a big book geek, so I am always reading something. And yeah, really have just had some great experiences with children's books lately, of all things. So yeah, I guess that's what I'd say about myself.
Okay, so let's get a little bit of an origin story. You may be able to tell throughout this podcast, I've had Marvel superheroes on the brain recently. I don't know. We all respond to COVID in different ways. But what
Right.
is your origin story? Because you're in Manitou, which for those listeners who aren't in Colorado, Manitou's kind of the cool hippie town in the mountains just outside of Colorado Springs. So you're in like this cool hippie place. You're doing worldview stuff for Summit. How is it you find this interest in children's books in the early 1900s? How does that start?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So, well, I have to start with a book not from the early 1900s. It would be the Narnia books, which I read for the first time when I was 13. And up until that point, I really didn't care much for reading at all. But when I read those books, I just had an amazing experience. Just loved them. I wanted to go to Narnia. I mean, it was the greatest. So, that kind of started my trajectory of reading. And didn't really read a whole lot of children's books necessarily after that until the year 2017. And I had been staffing at a sort of gap year college program that was happening down in Pagosa Springs. And one of the other staff members one evening was just sitting by the fire. I mean, we were all like, the entire retreat was taking place in this log cabin in the woods, which is just awesome setting. But anyway, this other staff member, she's sitting there reading this giant Wind in the Willows book. And I'd heard of
Mhm.
Wind in the Willows, but I never read it. And, so I just asked her, about the book, and she described it to me. She described the book as an old friend. And I just thought,
Mm.
wow, I've got to read this book. If someone can talk about a book like an old friend, I want to look at that. So yeah, I got myself a copy and I read that and I just loved it. And that sort of got me interested in other books that were being written at that period. So got into Winnie the Pooh and some other stuff that Kenneth Grahame had written. And wow, it was just really fun. So I'm encountering most of these books for the first time in my early 20s. So yeah, that's kind of how it started.
Awesome. Awesome. Now, Evangeline, go behind the scenes a
Mhm.
little bit. So the way we do this is I'll sort of have some topics and guests lined up, and I'll ask Evangeline and Mandy, like, hey, either of you like interested in this particular topic? And when I threw this one out, Evangeline volunteered right away.
Oh,
So
yes.
I'm guessing, Evangeline, you also have some very strong affection for children's books of this era. So which one of those have been favorites of yours?
Yes, absolutely. Some of my earliest memories are of my mom reading to us, and The Wind in the Willows, The Wizard of Oz was a big one. Anne of Green Gables, the E. Nesbit books. So all of that is like steeped in my childhood. And of course, Chronicles of Narnia. So yeah, when you put this out there, I'm like, oh yes, I'm there for children's books. Even though it's been a while, I actually have written children's books. I now write YA, but this is sort of the fond, warm memory for me of my childhood. So I'm excited.
Yeah, so I'll sort of give a little bit of my background too. I also happen to love children's books of this era. I kind of discovered them, just here and there. Obviously, Chronicles of Narnia. I'm in Anselm Society. That goes without saying. But I also started getting into, some of the older stuff by like George MacDonald. I went through a kick in that in college. I discovered Wind in the Willows just a few years ago, and it started off. I tried to get my boys to listen to it as just sort of like a book on tape as we're like driving. The boys were a little young for it, but I loved it. I thought it was so good. And I totally see, Ben, what you were saying about it being an old friend. And yeah, that once you start exploring the world of children's books from this era, like Alice in Wonderland, there's so much wonderful stuff there. So before we get going into the main stuff, we need to address this issue that I brought up very subtly in my intro. Okay, Wind in the Willows, for readers who aren't familiar, it's wonderful. Go read it right now. but it stars like a frog, a rat, a toad, all these like little creatures that live around a pond, and they have adventures. And it starts going like, okay, so it's like an actual little rat, little mole. They're all doing their things, but then they drive cars, they ride horses. It's like, wait, are these human size? Are they rat size? I don't know. Am I overthinking this, Ben? Give me the answer. What's going on here?
I don't know, man. I feel like the book is just so confusing on that level because, yeah, how does the frog at one point goes around and everybody confuses the frog with a washerwoman? Like, how does that work? I don't know. I really don't know the answer to this, except to say that kind of the origin of Wind in the Willows was they were just bedtime stories that Kenneth Grahame told his son. In fact, I just got a hold of an older book that was published by Kenneth Grahame's wife after he passed. And it was basically sort of a collection of some of the early editions of Wind in the Willows. Like, if he was away on business, he would actually write letters telling these stories to his son. And so I guess Kenneth Grahame was just a master storyteller, and he had sort of he liked whimsy. So he just kind of made it work. And maybe he was, kind of asleep when he was, telling one of these stories. I don't know. But yeah, I wish I could help more with that, but I really have no idea what's going on.
Okay, what was like Whitman? Consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, or something like that. Maybe that's my problem.
Okay.
I was going to say, like, not exactly that, but I think we, especially in our modern mindset, have this need for everything to make sense. And this kind of like drives me crazy, especially as I'm writing and I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to nail down how this, magic system works. And back then, or maybe through a child's viewpoint, you present this world wherein the frog is the character, but yes, he rides a horse as well. And that's not a problem because you didn't make it a problem. And, the child's brain didn't make it a problem. They're just interested in the story. So sometimes I wish we could suspend disbelief a little bit more with our modern brains.
No, and that's actually a good segue too, because one of the first points I wanted to get to was, ways that children's books of like the early 1900s, that era, differ from children's books today. Because, I'm very familiar with children's books today with, having young kids. And I'm kind of familiar with children's books of the 1900s, like I said, but I think you'd be able to speak to this better, Ben. What are the big sort of 1,000-foot view differences between children's books of that era and children's books of today?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think I would want to go back to maybe before even the early 1900s. And when you're talking about sort of books from the 1800s, we're dealing with a sort of a very like moralistic sort of didactic goal for children's books is that they have to teach something, right? So that is kind of the big picture for early 1800s, like children's stories, is they need to be teaching morals, right? Teach these children how to be good little Victorian angels kind of thing.
Yes.
Or, wisen them up with, all kinds of facts, from different sciences and things like that. And so I could perhaps say more about that. I don't know if we're going to talk more about that later, but yeah, so the early 1900s is where the sort of a story that is just, it's written for children to enjoy is sort of coming to its fullest. So, and I think we all like recognize the difference between a book that intentionally like is trying to tell us something, has a very, specific teaching point, and a book that's just a good story and sort of allows us to, as Evangeline mentioned earlier, sort of to escape and just get away from things for a bit. So, yeah, to be honest, I'm not a big reader of modern children's books. I just haven't gotten around to them yet. I want to, but so yeah, I would just say those are some of the things from the early 1800s and the 1900s that kind of stand out for me. So,
okay, so that definitely makes sense. And so I guess my follow-up question would be, when did this shift happen? Because once we get to books like, Winnie the Pooh, Alice in Wonderland, Wind in the Willows, they're definitely not merely didactic stories. There's more to it than that. So were those sort of on the cutting edge of children's literature at the time, or was there something else sort of in the culture driving that?
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm certainly no expert on this, but from what I understand, the whole idea of a book specifically for children really doesn't start to become a thing until the middle of the 1800s when people starting to think about childhood itself as a concept.
Mm.
So that's kind of one thing driving it. Another thing would be, and if you're interested, you can actually get this book. I think it's out of print, but you can probably find a cheap copy somewhere. It's just called The Tellers of Tales, and it's by Roger Green. And he sort of surveys children's literature from the early 1800s to around the 1960s, I think it is. And in that book, he sort of sees a book called Holiday House by Catherine Sinclair as sort of the breakout, sort of revolutionary children's book. And so as I was saying before, books prior to this point were very much, teach these children how to be good moral people, give them a bunch of learning. And Holiday House by Catherine Sinclair is just a book about some mischievous children who get into trouble all the time. So, you can get that book as well today. And in the introduction, it talks about how this book was almost scandalous at the time. People are like, what? This story has no point. It has no purpose. It's just about these children who, they're good kids, but they can't help but, accidentally set the bed on fire or ruin their last pair of good clothes or something. They're kids. And yeah, that's basically what the book was about. And so Roger Green, anyway, at least sees that book as being kind of a breakout for children's books. And then, 30 years later, you've got Alice in Wonderland, which is just crazy, right? So at least in that book, The Tellers of Tales, that's how Roger Green sort of paints it as sort of, you've got this shift away from like, no, we need to see children as, we need to write something for them that they'll actually enjoy, not just something to try to make them a better person or something like that. So, yeah.
I think it's really interesting what you were saying about how like kind of late 1800s is when we actually started thinking about the concept of childhood. And that's just so interesting because before that, children were an extension of really the workforce within the family, at least, for the lower classes. I'm not exactly sure. I can't come up with, what they were for the upper classes. Maybe just an extension of the master of the house. So then it was like, okay, so there's this thing, we're going to call it childhood now. And we're going to, and as in everything in the Victorian times, we're going to sort of create this rosy, glow around it that I don't know what that does, like sort of shields it from reality. And then we have a move to, let's actually think about children and, what they might be entertained by. And it's just so weird that we're kind of trying to define childhood instead of maybe studying it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Walter Scott, there's a good quote that he has, Sir Walter Scott. He said that, at the time he was writing, he said, in the rising generation, there's going to be no poets, wits, or orators because all play of the imagination is now carefully discouraged. And the books written for young persons, he says, are generally mere dry record of facts, unenlivened by any appeal to the heart or any excitement to the fancy. So it's a very much we just need to teach these children how to be, good people, which certainly, of course, we want to teach children, but I think we'll probably get to this later, but there's also an element here, I think, of valuing children as full members of the human community and not as sort of this, second class people who just, they need all the help they can get. So,
or just an extension of something else, of the family, of the workforce. Yeah.
Yeah. I like the way you put that, Ben. And something I was sort of, mulling over when you were speaking was, it seems like at the beginning of this era, we're like, when people were like, oh, childhood's a thing. Okay, cool. The books seem to be written by like, I don't know, like air quotes, like experts or people like, okay, we need to teach them very specific stuff. And one of the things about the Victorians, I think, is quite similar to people in our time, is maybe every time, is We are like, okay, well, we know best, right? We know more than any other
Right.
era. So you're welcome. Everyone who came before us, we'll tell you why you're wrong. So that's what
Yes.
starts with like these dry facts. But then it seems like the stories that actually capture people's imaginations and hearts, I think it's significant. They all seem to be told, they started off as, like a parent telling it to their child.
Mm.
That's what Wind in the Willows was. That's what Winnie the Pooh was.
Yeah.
Alice in Wonderland started Lewis Carroll telling it to a young child that he knew. It's just between like, okay, well, we'll create a perfect children's informational book in a lab versus like, hey, I'll tell my son a story and see what makes him laugh. And I
Yeah.
think it's interesting that telling the story to your kid is what endures.
Hmm.
Yeah. Which is why you have those elements of, a frog that can ride in a cart and drive horses, because it was a story, and, that's just what came to the person. So it's why it works.
Yeah, no, that's
Absolutely.
a great point.
Yeah, and it's also why like Winnie the Pooh is named Winnie the Pooh. Why does that make sense? Well, it's because like
It doesn't.
Right.
A. Milne's 3-year-old son named him. That's what 3-year-olds think is a good name, right? There's really nothing more to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, if you're telling the story directly to your kids, I mean, if you have kids, you probably know this, right? Like, you're not going to try to preach at them. Like, they're falling asleep.
Yeah.
They're not staying awake for your story, and they're not going to ask for another story the next night. They're just going to want to go to bed if that's all you're going to do. So, like, yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Matt, of, you're keeping the person, the child, you're actually telling them the story. That makes such a huge difference, because you can't forget, who you're telling it to. So
Yeah, and you get the instant audience feedback too. Evangeline,
right.
I'm guess Evangeline, your kids are obviously they're older now, but did you and Corey go
Yeah.
through like storytelling stages with them?
Oh, yes. In fact, my children's book that was published, The Dragon and the Turtle, was a story that I told my youngest at night when he was having trouble going to sleep. So I, identify with this, and I'm kind of like laughing thinking about, these authors and these classic children's books that have come about from exhausted parent brain at night. And it's like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and I don't know. And they're like, more. And I don't know. That's pure magic right there, when you're just like too tired to make it logical. And so you just vamp.
Yep. I mean, very, very true. And I'm thinking about one of the early Winnie the Pooh stories. Remember when he blows up a balloon and floats into the sky so he can steal honey from the
Yeah.
bees?
Oh,
I mean, if you think about it, it's like, I don't think you could float on a balloon that you blow up. But like, I picture like,
Right.
hey, like, shh. I'm really tired. Just go with it. Go with
Right.
it. Okay?
It works. Totally.
Yes.
So, Ben, when me and you were emailing about possible conversation topics for this, and you sent me C.S. Lewis quotation, I thought was really interesting, really fit conversation.
Yeah.
It's just C.S. Lewis's observation that a children's book not worth reading as an adult was probably not worth reading as a kid either. So maybe explain why you wanted to discuss that, what you had in mind with it.
Yeah. I've always found this quote particularly striking. And part of it is the fact that I really came to most of these children's books, again, like in my mid-20s. I did not read them as a kid. And what I found fascinating about so many of them is that they've just struck me as moving stories. I'm thinking of Winnie the Pooh here, The House at Pooh Corner. I think it's one of the last chapters where Al sort of gets displaced from his home and he needs a new home. And Eeyore thinks he's found him the perfect home. And everyone's like, oh, yes, it's perfect, except for it's Piglet's house. And Piglet just willingly gives Owl, his home. And Pooh says, well, that's all right. You can come and live with me, Piglet. And it's just this beautiful moment of just friendship and kindness, and almost like bringing me to tears. The first time I read it, I was just like, wow, this is just so good. So, yeah, I think that, this gets to, children are wise. They have their own wisdom, and we don't need to talk down to them. We don't need to, belittle them in our children's books or treat them like they're, just unintelligent. So I think the point that he's trying to get at there is when we write for children, yeah, don't talk down to them, because if it's not worth reading as an adult, it's probably not worth reading as a kid. And I think what he's doing is drawing comparison between, hey, both children and adults were human beings, or both full members of the human community. So, yeah, I think that's kind of what's always struck me about that quote.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Evangeline, once again, just based on what you've read with children's books and like having, raising your sons, I'm guessing you can think of plenty of examples of books that hold up well, and you could see rereading on your own of books like, oh, okay, like, oh, my kid likes it now, but he's not going to like it when he's older. So, which one of those really stick out to you?
Oh, that's a good question. I was just thinking about what Ben said about Pooh and sort of the comfort and the safety of home in a children's book, and like juxtaposed with wildness and adventure. And several books like come to mind. The Wizard of Oz, of course, is about home and safety and about having adventure. My favorite picture book of all time, which I'm sure that I think I give it to every person who has a baby that I know. It's called Little Fur Family. It's by Margaret Wise Brown. And it's about this little fur child who lives in the woods and has this home, and then goes out and has this adventure in the wild wood, and then comes back home to safety. And I think that that's so important. I'm also thinking about Skippy John Jones. Matt, do you know those books?
No, I'm actually writing them down so I can order them for my kids.
Oh, yeah. Skippy John Jones is fantastic. This, I can't remember if he's a Chihuahua who thinks he's a cat or a cat who thinks he's a Chihuahua. It's one or the other. And
it sounds great.
Oh, it's so good. And, it starts with, usually I think he gets in trouble and gets sent to his room. And then he has this wild adventure in his imagination. And then again is home. The same with where the wild things are.
I love where the wild things are.
I know. And I'm just fascinated by the concept of you are safe at home, and also there's wildness out there, and there are adventures, and they are good and maybe sometimes scary, but then you can come back home and be safe. And I think that that's such an important thing. And it's not that you have to say that. You don't say that to the kid. You read them the book that shows them that, and that's such a good grounding. So yeah, that's what came to mind, is the books that stick out to me from my own childhood and from reading to my boys.
Yeah, and I'll pile on to Where the Wild Things Are, because that's one of the ones I was I had in mind, because I first started reading it randomly in college. One of my literature classes, we studied children's literature, and that was one of the books my professor brought up. So that kind of had me go into it with a certain point of view, but I made sure to buy it for my kids, and it is my favorite one of their books that they have. I just think it is gorgeous. First of all, the artwork by Maurice Sendak is absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
And the story, the language looks very simple on the surface, but each one of the very few words carries a lot of weight and meaning. And you can tell it's wrestling with some really deep concepts, especially for kids of that age. Like my 3-year-old loves the book so much. And it's about, a boy who gets sent to his room, has an imaginary adventure, and he comes back to his home ready to, having wrestled with stuff about wildness, and it's so good. And again, it's a kid's book, but I would read it on my own. Absolutely.
Yeah. Have you read Frog and Toad? Do you know those
Frog
stories?
And Toad are friends?
Arnold Lobel, is it? Yes.
So I haven't read the books, but they have those claymation ones on YouTube. So me and my boys watch some of those together. They're really good.
Oh, yes. I love the books. So good. So funny as an adult. Just reading them, they're so funny. So it's the perfect example of that quote, because I would pick one of those books up and read it now and enjoy it.
Okay. So very, very quick possible tangent, but I think people listening are the right audience for this. If you check out Frog and Toad Are Friends on YouTube, it has a lot of the old claymations from the 1980s. They're very charming in a slightly cheesy way. But the voices of Frog and Toad are the guy who play Eugene on Adventures in Odyssey and the original Mr. Whitaker on Adventures in Odyssey.
Oh my gosh, weird.
Oh, well, there you go.
Head exploding emoji. I couldn't believe it when I realized it. Anyway, so Ben, in what you've been reading, have you seen any prominent examples, maybe like recently or like the early books of children's books that appeal to kids but aren't good for adults? And what do you think the real issues are with those?
Oh, yeah. So children's books that are good for kids but not for adults, you're saying?
Well, like you'll enjoy when you're like when you're 4, you'll read it and think it's cool.
Right,
when you come back to it older, you're like, oh, this is terrible.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So I would mention probably Roger Lancelin Green, who I mentioned earlier. He was a friend of C.S. Lewis's. And the main thing that he's remembered for is he compiled a lot of collections of myths for children. So he did the King Arthur myths, he did, Greek myths, Norse myths, Egyptian myths. And these books are just like great. Those ones are really, really good because he manages to, I think, write the myths in such a way that, it's at a level that, children can understand. And of course, if you've read mythology, you know that it can be quite sordid. So he manages to write it I mean, that might be an understatement, but, he writes it at a level that's appropriate for children. But he manages to do it without like sanitizing it, which I think is really cool. Unfortunately, his original fiction, some of which I've read, I've found to be less that way, where, I don't know, it tends to try, he wrote his own original story that was like set in the time of like, the Homer's Iliad. So it's about a little boy in Troy. And, it's not a bad book, but it's just kind of, it feels like it's sort of, it doesn't feel quite true. It feels like, we're kind of dealing with English children from the 1960s in Troy, and it doesn't quite work. And so I don't know. I think some of the issues are, I guess, one issue is trying to clean things up a little too nicely for children. I mean, maybe this gets to what we were talking about earlier with Wind in the Willows, like where it just, there's not necessarily consistency and it doesn't really matter that much. I mean, we could say the same things about the Narnia books, right? Like, they're in this magical world of Narnia, and then Santa Claus shows up, and you're like, what? Like, what's going on here? But yeah, I think, maybe a tendency that I notice sometimes is that tendency to make it too clean in terms of just everything being neat and in a box. And the other thing is just when you're really, really trying to like preach something to kids, that just, I feel like that just is distracting, and it doesn't make for very, very good reading. I mean, I would quote C.S. Lewis here again, where he said, when you're writing a book, don't try to, put a moral into it. If there's a moral, the story will tell you. And I think it's a really good insight. So yeah, I don't necessarily have a ton of examples that are coming to mind, but I think those are some of the issues maybe.
Yeah. And I think probably one of the reasons why examples aren't coming to your mind is that, those examples would have been lost to history, right? Like those are books that no one reads anymore because they were one of the flaws. And that I think that's important to keep in mind. And it seems like there's several different traps that you could fall into with children's literature. There's one that you mentioned where you make it too didactic. It has no heart. It's just trying to teach facts. There's another one, but you mentioned that one as well, where they're trying to make it too neat and tidy. But I think another one, you can see this especially with, more contemporarily, but this goes back several decades now for children's TV, children's movies. You get the feeling it's just sort of half baked because like, it's kids. What do they care? Bright colors and stuff. And that's one of the things that drives me the most crazy. Okay, wait. Let me get my soapbox, drag it here and step up on it. Okay. I cannot stand when people describe a children's movie as cute. It's like, oh, how's that movie? Oh, it was cute. Basically, to me, that is code for it's bad, but we pretend it doesn't matter because it's for kids and, whatever, kids like anything. And that drives me insane for the very reasons you've been talking about, Ben and Evangeline. If it's bad for adults, then why are we subjecting our kids to it? Yeah, they like bright colors, but don't they still deserve good stories? Okay, steps on the soapbox. Evangeline, how did you handle this with either with your kids or like what are things that you enjoyed growing up, then you realize, oh boy, this was bad. I only like this because I was 5. What are the ways you've reacted to that sort of thing?
Well, I don't remember a whole lot of, what I liked that I, later was like, ew. And the same with the boys because, well, okay, like I suffered through Captain Underpants and the How to Train Your Dragon books, which are so different from the movie.
Yeah, that's true.
And let's see. But the thing is, here's the thing. And if it's friendly for their brain, meaning like some of those like, kid books that are like half cartoon, half, paragraphs, those are really, really friendly for an ADHD brain. And if you hand a kid that and they read it and they're like, I read a book, that is so powerful. So I just have to like put a plug in for parents, suffering through those and allowing that to just have its space because there is value in it, for the kid's development. So, I'm just going to have to say that. I got to put that out there.
No, that's a really good like counterpoint to make. And another counterpoint is something I wonder about myself because let me give you an example. When I was a kid, kindergarten, first grade, I loved the Power Rangers. All right. That was the heyday of the Power Rangers. I loved Jason. My brother liked Billy. We would fight. We would talk about all the different episodes. I can still sing along to Tommy's Dragon Zord flute song. But when I look back on it, I actually watched them a couple years ago because they're on Netflix. I was like, these are awful. But I can still see how those sorts of shows, even though they're kind of bad, and you don't need to say they're kind of bad, they're bad. They did fire my imagination as a kid. They inspired me to like be active, to get into something, to, like I said, use my imagination. I can still see their influence in me today.
Yeah.
And I remember Andrew Peterson, when he was a keynote speaker at a Imagination Redeemed conference, he talked about that in a similar way where when he was like a nerdy middle schooler, he read a bunch of like fantasy books that were really bad, like the cheesy paperback fantasy books. But even those were able to like feed his imagination in a way that led to a lot of the stuff he's doing now. So there's other stuff going on there. So now that I've tried to complicate my own point, Ben, I'm just going to toss it over to you. What's your take? Like, do you have any similar experiences with stuff you liked as a kid? And what should we do with the value of good, bad kids shows or whatever?
Yes. Yeah, no, this is actually something I've thought about quite a lot. I mean, I guess I have these experiences even as an adult now. A good example would be Jurassic Park, the Jurassic Park movies.
Oh, yeah.
All of them are.
Are you going to say the first Jurassic Park was bad, Ben?
No.
Okay.
No,
You can continue though. Keep going.
Okay. Yes. What I was going to say is that the first Jurassic Park movie is amazing, but all of the other ones after that, I think, are pretty bad. Like, it was kind of like they were like, hey, what if we did the same thing over again and again? And what if we just put like half the amount of effort into it? I mean, in terms of the story, I mean, obviously they've done a lot with their CGI and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, those movies are total cotton candy besides the first one. But I love all of them. Like, even the last one, which everyone hated, like, I went and I saw it twice because I was just like, man, it's dinosaurs. It's awesome. Like, so, yeah, I mean, I totally can resonate with that. I think you just referenced good, bad literature. I think it's George Orwell that maybe coined that term. And he sort of put books like Sherlock Holmes or Dracula into them, like books that don't really have like a ton of substance, but are just really well written. And yeah, I think there's totally a place for that. Like, there's totally a place for that. So, I mean, there's a place for Jurassic Park. There's a place for Power Rangers. I don't think this needs to be some sort of, well, let's get all of that out and you'll only have to read the best stuff. But I think it is to say, right, that like, we can kind of maybe think about those kind of books or movies or whatever it is. It's a bit of junk food. And like junk food in in proportion is good. Like it's enjoyable and there's, but if all you eat is junk food, right, you're going to have a lot of problems. So I think it's not to say like, let's discard all of that, but to go beyond it. So yeah, I don't know. I guess that would be my take on it.
Good take.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that is the good way to view it. And yeah, maybe it's not so much, okay, my children are only exposed to the finest of literature and film and cinema, but make sure that it's balanced, like you're not totally shielding your children from all the stuff out there, but you're also giving them some fun stuff here and there. Like, can I give you a crazy example that I heard? So for a while, me and Danielle lived in Connecticut right after we were married, and Danielle would substitute teach at this kind of ritzy preschool where like rich Connecticuters sent their kids. And one of the days one of the students brought in a book about, what was it, like the smallpox vaccine? Must have been a really weird kid. But so they read about all the people who died of like smallpox. And one of the parents comes up to Danielle afterwards, like, just so you know, I wish we hadn't read that book because we really haven't talked to our son about death yet. It's like, I think he's going to figure it out eventually.
Right.
You can't shield him from this forever. So that's like, if you just try to shield the kid, you just try to appease them with bright colors and cotton candy. Both of those are bad, but mixing them up can be a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're running a little low on time, and I want to make sure we have some time for some recommendations. So Ben, for those reads, probably a lot of listeners there is like, oh, cool. Like, what are some good books to sort of dip my toe into the water from children's books of this era? What are some good ones to, share with my kid or my nephew, or ones that I just might want to get into? What are some books that you'd recommend that really get these things right that we've been talking about?
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I'm excited about this part. I love sharing about books I like. The hard thing about some of the books from the 1900s is just that, Wind in the Willows is a great example of this. I actually bought this book for my niece, and I think she was about 4 or 5 at the time when I bought it for her. And, I would read it to her and I was like, this language is pretty hard just because we don't talk that way anymore, right? Whereas Kenneth Graham's son, I'm sure, was, tracking with it. We just don't talk that way anymore. So, the original edition of Wind in the Willows can be kind of tricky, but it's definitely worth reading. I've been reading it to my niece very slowly. So like every time I go back home, I'll read her a portion of it, and that seems to be working okay. So, but yeah, there's lots of versions of that are sort of like where they sort of made the language a little bit easier. So that's a great one. Winnie the Pooh is pretty accessible. I love Winnie the Pooh. Secret Garden. If you haven't read The Secret Garden, oh my goodness, you just gotta go and read that book. One of the most beautiful stories ever. All of George MacDonald's stuff, well, I should say most of it, I really like. Princess and the Goblin, Princess and Curdie are great. But probably the one that I would be most excited about sharing is The Golden Age by Kenneth Grahame. Either of you heard of this book?
No.
I have heard of it, but I couldn't tell you a single thing about it. I've just heard the title.
Okay, yeah, it's written by Kenneth Grahame, and apparently, like, it was really popular at one point. Here's a random piece of trivia for you. Teddy Roosevelt, President of the United States, loved this book. But it's a kid's book, and it's sort of in the tradition of Holiday House, which we were talking about earlier, in that it's just a story about sort of rambunctious, mischievous children growing up. And it is one of my 5 favorite books of all time. Like, it's really a phenomenal collection and just kind of good. The Golden Age, it's, the title itself, the author's kind of looking back on these amazing, wonderful days of childhood. And he just takes you right along with him, and you can relate to the characters. And it's a really, really beautiful story. So I highly recommend The Golden Age by Kenneth Grahame to everyone. So that would be my number one.
All right, awesome. As you were talking about it, I wrote down Golden Age in my notes and underlined it. So I fully intend to follow up on this.
That's good. That's good. Yeah. What about y'all?
So I love Lewis Carroll. So I really enjoy Alice in Wonderland. I really enjoy his poetry. The Jabberwocky I love so much. I wrote
Okay.
an academic paper on it in college. I love it so much.
Oh, wow.
Writing the academic paper did not quench my love for it. That's how much I love it. And yeah, I think there's a lot of really good light verse from around that time as well. So that's what I would say more generally. How about you, Evangeline?
Well, I can't not recommend The Wizard of Oz. That was one of my favorites. But there's more than just The Wizard of Oz. There's tons of Oz books. And they are weird and crazy and fun. So, and those are things that I like. You probably have heard of that one. And then Edward Eager, Magic by the Lake is another really good one. So,
all right.
That's awesome.
It's good to know that you're a fan of the Wizard of Oz extended universe. That's noteworthy.
It's something.
I've been a little scared to read it because it all seems really trippy, and it's like I feel like you need to be in a very specific mood for this.
I know. I should probably find out a little bit more about what, or maybe I don't want to know what went into the writing of those, because I just remember the craziness, and I know that it's kind of deep in my substrate as a creative person now. And every once in a while, things will come out, and I'm like, oh, that was from one of those crazy Wizard of Oz books.
Oh. Wow.
So just to clarify, it's things that are crazier than the flying monkeys in the first book.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. There you go.
There's a cat in one of them that has a clear head, and it has pink marbles, and the pink marbles are the brain, and you can see the pink marbles turning. And that was a saying in my family, for years, that when someone was thinking, you could see their pink marbles turning. So yeah, crazier than flying monkeys.
Yeah, that's pretty
all
crazy.
Right, I cannot think of a better way to end the show than that. So, Evangeline, Ben, thank you both so much. It's been really great talking about these books with you both. And well, things are winding down at the Anselm Digital Pub. Fire's down to embers. The customers are trudging home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.